Welcome to AERO 2230, ProPilot 1, presentation number 14 on flight physiology. It's important to remember that the pilot is a human being and is subject to physical limitations just like any other human being. So we need to understand those physical limitations and do our best to mitigate them. One of the leading causes of pilot impairment is hypoxia. Hypoxia is commonly found at high altitudes, and it can easily be remedied with supplemental aviation oxygen if you're flying an aircraft that isn't pressurized. Hypoxia is simply a lack of oxygen in the bloodstream. And to understand the different types of hypoxia, we need to first understand the respiration process, or how oxygen enters our body and our blood and then is transported for use by the other cells in our body. There are 4 steps to the respiration process. The first step is diffusion, where outside air, which is about 21% oxygen, is inhaled into the lungs, and the oxygen is transferred into our blood through diffusion. In the second step, our blood grabs the oxygen for transportation. And then in step 3, the blood is circulated. The heart pumps the blood so that it circulates throughout the body. In the last step, the cells use the oxygen that is delivered by the blood cells, and the cells must be able to effectively use the oxygen. So the process in the circulatory system starts with the blood being oxygenated in the lungs and sent to the brain and other body tissues through the left auricle and left ventricle of the heart. The blood is then circulated back to the lungs through the right auricle and the right ventricle to be oxygenated and subsequently returned to the brain and the body tissues once again. The most common cause of hypoxia is a reduction in oxygen when at higher altitudes. And it's not because there's less oxygen at higher altitudes, it's just that the body is unable to absorb enough oxygen due to the reduced pressure at high altitudes. Below 12,500 feet, there's usually not a problem. And most people don't always experience hypoxic systems at the same altitudes, but 12,500 feet is a guideline. After a sudden failure of the oxygen supply, it can literally take minutes to seconds for a pilot to experience severe symptoms of hypoxia. If there's a sudden failure of the oxygen supply at 18,000 feet, it can take between 20 and 30 minutes before a pilot can experience the symptoms of hypoxia. But at 40,000 feet, it could only take 12 to 15 seconds. Between 12,500 and 15,000 feet, pilots can experience things like poor judgment, memory loss, coordination problems, dizziness, and a feeling of euphoria due to hypoxia. Pilots and crews are required to use supplemental oxygen between 12,500 and up to 14,000 feet if they're at those altitudes for more than 30 minutes. Above 14,000 feet, pilot and flight crew must use oxygen continuously, and above 15,000 feet, every occupant in the aircraft must be provided with supplemental oxygen. It's important to remember that hypoxia doesn't affect everyone in the same way, and it takes different time for each person to react to hypoxia. So symptoms can be gradual and hard to recognize. If you suspect hypoxia, it's important to look for certain signs. A bluish color in the fingernails or lips, poor judgment, problems with memory, dizziness, or a feeling of euphoria are all signs that you may be, or your passengers may be, suffering from hypoxia. Above 15,000 feet, performance can deteriorate within 15 minutes. So try to bring along a second pilot so that 2 of you can detect the problem together. And if you are above 14,000 feet and you're not in a pressurized aircraft, breathe oxygen through a nasal cannula or a mask and descend to a lower altitude. So again, here are the regulations concerning supplemental oxygen. If you're flying in an aircraft that is not pressurized, above 12,000 feet MSL, the flight crew must use oxygen if they are between 12,500 feet and 14,000 feet for more than 30 minutes. Above 14,000 feet, the flight crew is required to use oxygen for the entire duration of the flight, and above 15,000 feet, passengers must also be provided with oxygen. So again, some symptoms to look for: headache, slowed reaction time, poor judgment, euphoria, impaired vision, drowsiness or dizziness, numbness, blue fingernails or blue lips, and also limp muscles, a feeling of weakness. At very high altitudes, again, the lack of pressure at those altitudes creates a problem with diffusion. Again, diffusion is where the air is inhaled into the lungs and the oxygen is absorbed into the blood. That doesn't happen at high altitudes. And when this fails, the result is hypoxic hypoxia. If the blood is unable to carry or grab the oxygen because of blood disease or carbon monoxide poisoning, then the result is called hypemic hypoxia. Again, the blood's inability to grab or carry the oxygen is hypemic hypoxia. Stagnant hypoxia is due to a lack of circulation, and that can be due to disease, or it can be too high positive G's in the airplane. Stagnant hypoxia is due to a lack of circulation, and that can be due to disease, or it can be due to high positive load factors in the airplane. If our bodies experience sustained positive G's, the blood is unable to reach our brain, and the first symptom that you would experience is a loss of vision. That's known as gray out. And finally, the fourth type of hypoxia is known as histotoxic hypoxia, and it's a result of the cell's inability to effectively use oxygen. It's usually caused by drug use, either alcohol or narcotics. Another common problem that pilots experience in flight is hyperventilation. Hyperventilation is due to too little carbon dioxide in the body, and it's usually caused by stress or excitement that causes someone to breathe too rapidly. It can cause drowsiness, hot and cold tingling sensations in the fingers, and the remedy for hyperventilation is to slow the breathing. And some people will even breathe into a paper bag to help with hyperventilation. Carbon monoxide poisoning is a common issue for pilots in flight. Carbon monoxide is a deadly gas, but you can't smell it and you can't see it. It's caused by exhaust gases somehow getting into the cockpit, and a common entry point is through the heater, because the heater in a general aviation aircraft usually gets its heat from the exhaust system. So if there's a leak in the exhaust system, that can result in carbon monoxide gases entering the cockpit. Carbon monoxide gas is 200 times more attractive to red blood cells than oxygen, so it reduces oxygen saturation levels. Carbon monoxide poisoning can be aggravated at high altitudes, and it usually results in confused thinking, uneasiness, headache, blurred vision, dizziness, and a tightening across the forehead. If you suspect that you might have carbon monoxide poisoning, land as soon as possible. Turn off the heater and open the fresh air vents to get rid of as much carbon dioxide in the cabin as you can. If you have oxygen in the airplane, use it immediately and turn it to maximum flow. One physiological problem that has led to many fatal accidents is spatial disorientation. Our bodies are designed to perceive our orientation in space using three major systems. The first and major system is our visual system. We use vision for 90% of our orientation in space. The second system is our vestibular system, which is located in our inner ear. When our heads move, fluid shifts inside of three canals within our inner ear, and this moving fluid stimulates nerves that send orientation information to our brains. The third system is our kinesthetic system, or the nerves in our muscles and our skin. We sense our orientation in space through our muscles and our nerves, and that information is sent to the brain with the other information from the vestibular system and the visual system. When these three inputs agree, we are aware of our spatial orientation. Again, our visual system accounts for 90% of our spatial orientation, and our visual system's main organ is the eye. And the eye is a very complicated organ. The eye receives light through the pupil and focuses that light on the retina through a lens. The retina is made up of rods and cones. The cones are concentrated in the foveal region directly in back of the lens. Cones sense color, detail, and distant objects, and we use cones mostly during the day. The rods are located on the peripheral regions of the retina, and rods are not sensitive to color. We only see black and white with the rods. We use rods primarily at night, and we can see moving objects, daylight and darkness with rods. Rods are used in our peripheral vision because, again, they're located on the peripheral regions of our retina. Because the cones are only active during the day and we use rods primarily at night, it's important to use peripheral vision for scanning for traffic at night, because if you're looking straight ahead, there's a blind spot located where your cones are located on the back of your retina. So if you're focusing straight ahead when you're scanning for traffic at night, you're focusing light on the cones, and again, cones are not active at night. Haze can be a real problem for pilots because haze reduces visibility, and it also creates the illusion that you're further from the runway than you actually are, and so it can cause you to fly a lower approach. It also makes objects appear further away than they actually are. There are several visual illusions that you should look out for when you're flying in less than ideal weather. One is called false horizon. If you're flying around a cloud deck, it's easy to mistake that cloud deck for the horizon when it may not be level with the horizon. If you're using that cloud deck for a reference to maintain straight and level flight, that could cause you to become spatially disoriented. If you're used to flying at a runway that looks like the runway in the center, then flying into an airport with a narrower or a wider runway than you're used to could cause you to fly either a higher approach than you would normally fly or a lower approach. If you're flying into an airport with a narrow runway, then you may think that you're higher than you really are and fly a low approach. If you're flying into an airport with a wider runway than you're used to, you may think that you're lower than you really are and fly a high approach. So runway width can make a big difference in how you fly your final approach to a landing. Nighttime can present a particular problem for pilots on approach to a runway without a visual approach slope indicator, because it can be difficult to determine whether you're too high, too low, or right on the approach glide path. If you are on approach to a runway at night that doesn't include a visual approach slope indicator, you should use the spacing of the runway lights to help you determine whether or not you're on the glide path. Another visual illusion that you can experience at night is called the black hole approach. This can occur when you're on approach to a runway at night that has very few visual references around it. There's no lights, nothing to help you make a judgment about whether you're on the right path down to the runway. It can actually cause you to fly a very low approach because there are no visual references. It looks as if you're too high. Any kind of reduction of visibility is going to create visual illusions that will make it difficult for you to judge whether you're too high, too low, whether you're on the correct glide path down to a runway on the final approach. Here's a table of some common illusions and the results of those illusions to help you stay aware of these and compensate for them if you think you may be subject to one. The second system that helps us stay oriented in space is the vestibular system, or the inner ear. And here is a diagram of what the inner ear looks like. You can see that there are semicircular canals filled with fluid, and in those canals you have hair cells that move in response to the movement of the liquid within the semicircular canals. The movement of those hairs stimulate cells which send signals to the brain telling you how you're oriented in space. The three semicircular canals in the middle ear send information to the brain concerning movement around different axes. For example, one of the semicircular canals sends information about pitch, the second one sends information about roll, and the third sends information about yaw. Within the semicircular canal you have something called a cupula. The cupula contains the nerve endings that receive information from the hairs that are stimulated in the semicircular canal whenever they sense movement. When we accelerate in an automobile or in an airplane, because the fluid inertia self-cancels in the semicircular canals, there's no movement of the hair, and so we don't sense any kind of movement whenever we're accelerating. There are times when two different types of movements stimulate the hairs and the nerves in the semicircular canal in the same way, leading us to think we're doing one thing when we're actually doing another. For example, when we initially accelerate, the hairs and the nerves in the semicircular canal stimulate in the same way as tilting backwards. So we could, if we don't have any visual references, mistake an acceleration for tilting backwards. That could cause us to push the nose of the aircraft down when we're actually straight and level. The same thing happens when we decelerate. The hairs and the nerves in the semicircular canal are stimulated in the same way that they're stimulated when we tilt forward. So if we don't have any visual references, we may feel that we're tilting forward when we're only decelerating, and that could cause us to pull back on the pitch and go into a stall. So the challenge for us as pilots is to recognize when one of these systems is being fooled. If you are ever in the situation where you're flying in limited visibility and you start to feel disoriented, the most important advice I can give you is to fly and trust your instruments. That's why even as a private pilot, you're required to have 3 hours of instrument training, flying just by reference to your instruments, so that you can get used to it, see what it's like, and become better at it before you ever get into the cockpit alone. Remember, our visual system is 90% of our spatial orientation. So spatial disorientation is most common at night and in low visibility. And again, overcoming spatial disorientation means relying on your flight instruments. That's the end of presentation number 14 on aviation physiology. Our next presentation and our last presentation for the semester will be on VOR navigation.